Richard Roberts here. I'm already getting tired of saying that. You're probably getting tired of hearing it. What we're looking at now is a fine example of the second series of comedies that Snub Pollard did for the Weiss brothers. Again, here's Les Goodwin's Always Reliable, taking over for the drunken James Davis. A little way to be remembered. APC, Sign of a Good Picture. Not great, but good. I wouldn't hold them to that. But no, actually, these aren't bad at all. It is definitely a Laurel and Hardy rip-off series. I think it's the safest way to say it. I mean, we can call them impersonators, or can't say they're doing an homage. It's kind of hard to do an homage when the people you're homaging are doing it right at the same time. So rip-off series. Might as well, spill the beans. Here's Marvin Loback, who played the Oliver Hardy rip-off impersonation, and here's Snub. He was sort of going for Stan Laurel. They always both wore derbies, but it's really safe to say, in the 1927-28 period, Laurel and Hardy hit so big right at the end of the silent era that all the comedy studios had Laurel and Hardy type teams, fat and skinny people. Oh, here's Tiny Lipsum, Jack Tiny Lipsum playing the brakeman, another heavy-set comic you used to see quite a bit. Very busy, worked for everybody. Senate Roach, Columbia. You see him a lot in the 30s, especially Columbia. He's working for, he's in a lot of Three Stooges comedies. He's in Punch Drunks, Three Little Pigskins. He's in a great one, 1936 Columbia comedy with Monty Collins and Tom Kennedy called Midnight Blunders, where he plays a monster, basically, an electric ape monster, sort of, but all they have is the facial mask. It's kind of ape-like, and they don't have the rest of the costume, so he's just wearing like a jumpsuit with it. But Jack Tiny Lipsum played a lot of heavies, a lot of villains, that sort of thing in comedies. But like I said, Laurel and Hardy were so popular that most of the comedy producers decided to have their own fat and skinny teams. Max Sennett took Billy Bevan and Vernon Dent and teamed them in a bunch of two-reelers in 27, 28, 29. Here's a two-headed cow. See those every day. Kind of a low-budget two-headed cow. It's like two cow heads and a bit of carpet padding. Well, on a Weiss budget, you take what you can get. But Educational then also teamed Monty Collins and Vernon Dent again in another sort of Laurel and Hardy series, 1929. This is being shot down at the old LA Santa Fe train depot, which was their train station until they built Union Station in the late 30s. You see it in a lot of comedies, most notably Birthmarks, 1929, Laurel and Hardy, early talkie. But that's it, the train stations were always being used. And Marvin Loback had actually already been part of a Laurel and Hardy type team. Before he did these, he did a series with a diminutive comic named Bud Duncan, who you'll see later, who was also busy at Weiss. But they did a series of one-reelers for William Pizer, who was a producer even the Weiss brothers thought were cheap. He was the cheapest of the cheap. And the Weiss brothers actually distributed that series as well. But Loback goes way back to the teens. Started with Max Sennett, worked for most of the comedy producers. Hal Roach, he worked there with Snub Pollard, Stan Laurel, Paul Parrott in the early 20s. Very busy at Sennett in the 20s. Even worked with Oliver Hardy in one 1927 Max Sennett comedy, Crazy to Act, which was one of Hardy's occasional moonlightings. I think maybe his only moonlighting at the Sennett Studios. But now Pollard had, again, after the collapse of Snub Pollard comedies in early 1927, to recoup his financial losses, Snub had gone back into vaudeville, and spend another year there before the Weiss brothers called them back to do this series in it was mid-1928. They did 2 seasons of the Pollard Lowbacks, 28, 29, and 29 and 30, which made them very late releases in terms of silent comedies. But in fact, the Weiss brothers, again, because they were distributing these mostly in the South and the Midwest, a lot of those theaters the small town theaters especially, took some time getting wired for sound. But that last series that they did in 2930 have synchronized soundtracks. Weiss brothers went out and hired a very 2-bit orchestra, which is definitely under-rehearsed and not the best musicians in the world, but they play some rather down and dirty scores with some down and dirty sound effects. But again, those were some of the last silent 2-reel comedies produced. It's interesting that they spent that money, although you're definitely luckier having the golden tones of Phil Carley or Dave Drazen accompanying these. Those guys are 2 of the best accompanists working today in a field which it's kind of like blacksmithing. Silent film accompanists today. There aren't many of them because there isn't as much call as there used to be. But like I said, these Pollard Lowbacks were they weren't just ripping off the Fat, Skinny Laurel and Hardy teaming. They were literally remaking Laurel and Hardy films. This one is actually one of the more original ones. There's one comedy called Sock and Run, which the first reel is a total remake of a Laurel and Hardy called Putting Pants on Phillip. The second reel is a remake of another Laurel and Hardy comedy called Battle of the Century. There's also one called Men About Town, where they go out on the golf links. Again, total remake of Laurel and Hardy Should Married Men Go Home. Like I said, here's Harry Martell playing the policeman. Another busy supporting actor at the Weiss brothers. You're going to see him in a number of these comedies. Harry worked in, mainly B-westerns, and he's working at Universal for the Stern brothers, who produced a lot of the Universal comedies. He was in some of the Sid Saylor. Sid Saylor had a series at Universal called Let George Do It, but mostly, between the Weiss brothers' short comedies and their B-westerns at Universal, that was really where Harry kept busy playing villains. Usually, tall guys and mustaches usually played villains, but like I said, so these comedies were definitely just complete Laurel and Hardy rip-offs. The gags they're borrowing from. In fact, this gag here with the fence, that appears in at least one other comedy. That's the Monty Banks comedy, 1924, Pay or Move. But comedians were always borrowing from each other. I mean, so that's reasonably fair. And again, like there were so many Chaplin impersonators making pictures in the late teens. Like I said, I guess the Laurel and Hardy impersonators sort of also considered it fair game. But like I said, gags went on forever. I mean, how many different comedians did the mirror routine? Chaplin does it in The Floor Walker. Charlie Chase does it in the 20s. Marx Brothers, of course, in the 30s. Lucille Ball and Harpo Marx. Probably goes way back before that to Music Hall, Commedia dell'arte. Probably had 2 cavemen in the cave, doing each other's moves. So some of these gags were extremely, extremely ancient. And even Stan Laurel borrowed from himself. So, and did many gags over and over and over again. Well, now here we are. This location is Echo Park in Edendale, now Glendale. This park, as many of the parks in Los Angeles, was a constant location for silent film comedies. Echo Park used quite a lot by the Senate studios because the studio was literally just north up the street on Alvarado from where Echo Park is. But Echo lake is, I think the place most comedians were baptized into the brotherhood of comics. You had to fall into the lake once or twice before you were really, a silent film comic. But that lake's not very clean. That was before antibiotics too. So those guys were definitely tough. But yeah, as I said, just across from Echo Park is a huge religious temple, I guess, church. It was built by Aimee Semple McPherson, one of the great evangelists of the late 20s. It's still there, still has her name on it. Rather impressive edifice. The temple, not Amy. And like I said, this Echo Park's still pretty much unchanged. You can go there now, and the lake's still the same. The boathouse, that bridge. This is actually where they're shooting here, is on the little island that's in the middle of the park. That the bridge, or in the middle of the lake actually, that the bridge goes up to. And yeah, it was like Les Goodwins, who again was like the most steady, reliable of the Weiss, and busy of the Weiss brother directors. He directed both seasons of the Pollard Lowbacks, and directed the majority of the Weiss brother comedy product, I think, at the time. Was really, this is where he cut his teeth in doing comedy, and certainly continued. There's a good shot of the lake and the park. But Goodwin's, again, this was perfect training for him to be working later on at RKO and television in the 50s. It is really interesting watching heavy-set comedians like Marvin Loback and Tiny Lipsum doing all the physical stuff that you see them doing in these comedies. It's like, rather amazing for someone carrying that sort of weight. Although I think it was harder on them than we really realize, especially when we realize Marvin Loback died in 1938 when he was only 42. Tiny Lipsum died in 1947, I believe. Yeah, 47. He was only 46 years old. Oh, here's a gag. Talking about repeating gags. This is a Stan Laurel gag. It was done first in a Stan Laurel solo comedy called The Egg, one of his early comedies he made for Bronco Billy Anderson back in 1922. Laurel then redid it the following year in a Hal Roach comedy called The Noon Whistle. And then, in fact, I think did it in a late Laurel and Hardy comedy. Yes, it was Fox feature they did in 1941, Great Guns. So, again, these gags had long lives, very, very much immortal. It looks like, also like a lot of these films, Reel 1 doesn't have that much to do with Reel 2, and now they're becoming waiters. Here's Thelma Daniels, who's technically the leading lady. Somebody you saw in silent comedies a lot in the late 20s. Started as a Senate bathing beauty and worked in a few Senate comedies. Not a particularly distinguished career. She was busy again at Universal working for the Stern Brothers. She appears in a number of the Sid Saylor Let's George Do It comedies. She starred in the What Happened to Jane series in 1927. But after the Weiss comedies, few appearances here, her career pretty much fizzled out by talkies. I think it's over. I think she retired like a lot of actresses then, gave it up for marriage. One little bit of info, she is the mother of Philadelphia Phillies general manager Pat Gillick, for anybody who cares out there. I don't know if we have any sports fans listening or not. I had a film historian friend whose name will remain nameless as long as the payments keep coming in, who contacted me several years ago regarding the Weiss brother comedies. He had an incredible theory that it wasn't Snub Pollard and Marvin Loback who were ripping off Laurel and Hardy, but in fact Laurel and Hardy who were ripping off Snub Pollard and Marvin Loback, partially because thanks to Blackhawk Films, who issued some of these pictures to the home markets in the 70s, 16mm and 8mm, got the dates wrong for the release of them. They were listing them as 1926-27 releases, and this historian, because of that, thought, well, you line this up against the Laurel and Hardy filmography, and these pictures came out first. But no, I burst his bubble. I thought he felt like he might have had a big scoop there. He could like rub in the Laurel and Hardy fans' faces. But I burst that bubble. I said, no, they were in fact 28, 29, and 30 releases. In fact, you can find in the 1929 Film Daily yearbook one of the few ads that I think the Weiss brothers ever bought for their comedy series, and in there's an ad for the Snub Pollard 29-30 season. So, yeah, oh well. It would have been interesting to think Laurel and Hardy were ripping off from these low-budget comedies, but it didn't happen. Now, Pollard's career as a star comic, certainly, this was pretty much it. In the 30s, he was working as a supporting player, a bit player. He was still very, very busy. I mean, he was making appearances in comedies at Educational, occasionally at Hal Roach, a lot of work at RKO, both in shorts and in features. Even some major supporting roles in RKO features like Stingaree, which is a 1934 picture with Richard Dix and Irene Dunn. The Weiss brothers even hired him again. He plays Dave O'Brien's airplane pilot buddy in the 1936 serial The Black Coin that the Weiss has produced for stage and screen production. It's probably Snub's last hurrah. In the late 30s, he was a Western sidekick for cowboy star Tex Ritter. He played Pee-wee in a series of pictures that Tex Ritter made for producer Ed Finney at Grand National. It's like 36 to 38. And Pollard even is still wearing his old makeup. I guess Tex Ritter had been a silent comedy fan, and he remembered Snub, and so he thought Snub would be a great sidekick. A lot of film comics ended up playing Western sidekicks. Certainly Al St. John became Fuzzy St. John, was working with Dave O'Brien, Lash LaRue, a number of others. Sid Saylor was a Western sidekick. Andy Clyde was Hopalong Cassidy's sidekick for a number of years. But Snub kept busy. I mean, he was always a bit player, and you see him in a lot of things without his makeup, no mustache. Sometimes it makes him a little harder to recognize, but oh goodness, he's busy all through the 30s, 40s. You see him in a lot of Columbia comedies. He's in Three Stooges shorts like Monkey Businessmen. A lot of features. He's in Johnny Belinda. He plays the guy who brings all of the letters to Santa Claus into the courtroom, Miracle on 34th Street. He's in, Beautiful Blonde from Bashful Ben, Preston Sturges picture. I'll tell you, a really good shot of Snub. You can see him as a bit player in the opening of Day the Earth Stood Still, when everyone's listening to the news about the flying saucer landing. Snub, there's a great shot of him close up where he's a cabman listening to the radio. And, in fact, now I think they only know this from studio records because you really can't tell in the film, but Snub is the man Gene Kelly gives the umbrella to in the end of the Singin' in the Rain number in Singin' in the Rain. And so there was also, you can make a good living doing this. Snub was working very busily all through the 50s. You see him on television. You see him on the Colgate Comedy Hours. Last person was Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis liked Snub, used him a lot. In fact, one of Snub's last appearances is the end of The Errand Boy in 1961, Jerry Lewis, where Jerry's riding through the Paramount lot and everyone's going up, love your latest picture, Jerry. And Snub comes up and goes, Jerry, I saw your new picture last night. It's great. And Jerry goes, thanks, Snub. Nice little tribute. In fact, Snub was working to the day he died in 1962. The last thing he was working on was The Rifleman. And in fact, Johnny Crawford, who played Chuck Connor's son on that show, and now he's an orchestra leader. It's a great hot dance band. Plays 20s music in Los Angeles. But Johnny Crawford remembers Snub Pollard working on an episode of The Rifleman. And again, Johnny Crawford, silent film fan, knew who he was and went up to him, talked to him, and Snub was really impressed that Johnny knew who he was. And he said, well, okay, it was Friday, and he said, I'll bring you an autographed still on Monday. And Johnny Crawford looked forward to it all weekend. And when he came to the set on Monday, he discovered Snub Pollard had passed away that weekend. Died, I think, January 19th, 1962. So Snub was, again, working till he died. And, perhaps Snub wasn't one of the great comic geniuses of all time, but a fine clown and very busy actor with many hundreds of films to his credit. And the Weisses are some of his, frankly, better starring opportunities. He didn't make that many two-reelers, but we hope you enjoyed taking a look at Snub Pollard and Marvin Loback, Laurel and Hardy other team.